They said humans were primitive, that we were nothing more than violent apes who had barely crawled out of our own atmosphere. The Galactic Council had dismissed Earth as a backwater planet, its people unworthy of true citizenship among the stars. But sometimes the most primitive hearts hold the greatest courage. When Captain Marcus Chun crash-landed on the forbidden moon of Zirian Prime, he expected to die alone in the crystal caves beneath its surface. What he didn't expect was to find the most beautiful being in the galaxy chained in those same caves, waiting for a death sentence that would spark an interstellar war. Love, they say, knows no boundaries. But what happens when those boundaries are written in the laws of empires, enforced by fleets of warships, and punishable by the extinction of entire species? This is the story of how a single human's whispered wish changed the fate of the galaxy forever. This is the story of why humanity's greatest strength was never our technology, our weapons, or our wars. It was our refusal to let love die without a fight. The warning alarm screamed through the cockpit of the small human survey vessel as Captain Marcus Chun fought with controls that no longer responded to his commands. Sparks flew from damaged panels, while the acrid smell of burning circuits filled the cramped space. Through the viewport, the forbidden moon of Zirian Prime grew larger with each passing second, its crystalline surface reflecting the light of 3 distant suns in brilliant, deadly beauty. Marcus had been on a routine mapping mission along the outer rim of the Terran colonial zone when his ship's navigation system malfunctioned, pulling him deep into Zilithian Empire space. The Zilithians were one of the most powerful races in the Galactic Council, and their territory was strictly off-limits to humans. Earth had been granted only limited membership in the galactic community 5 years ago, and that membership came with strict rules about where human ships could travel. The impact came hard and fast. Marcus felt his body slam against the restraints as his ship carved a burning trench across the moon's surface before finally coming to rest against a massive crystal formation. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red as he struggled to assess the damage. The main drive was completely destroyed, the communication array was offline, and life support was failing. He had maybe 6 hours of breathable air left. Marcus activated his emergency beacon, though he knew the chances of rescue were slim. No one knew where he was, and even if they did, no human ship would dare enter Zilithian space to retrieve him. He would die here, alone on this beautiful, alien moon, and his death might even trigger a diplomatic incident between Earth and the Zilithian Empire. As he gathered his survival gear, Marcus tried not to think about his sister Sarah back on Earth, or about how she would react when the news of his disappearance reached her. She had begged him not to take this job, worried that humanity's position in the galaxy was too precarious for him to be flying solo missions along the frontier. He should have listened to her. The airlock hissed open, and Marcus stepped out onto the surface of Zirian Prime. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's, and the air was breathable, though it tasted of ozone and something sweet he couldn't identify. The landscape before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. Massive crystal formations stretched toward the purple sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces refracting the light of the 3 suns into rainbow patterns that danced across the ground. According to his scanner, there were extensive cave systems beneath the surface. If he was going to survive until his air ran out, he would need shelter from the intense radiation that bathed the moon's surface during the day cycle. Marcus shouldered his pack and began walking toward what looked like a cave entrance at the base of a particularly large crystal spire. The cave system was vast and beautiful. Bioluminescent crystals provided a soft blue glow that illuminated passages carved from living rock. Strange formations jutted from the walls and ceiling, and Marcus could hear the distant sound of running water echoing through the tunnels. He followed the sound, hoping to find a source of fresh water that might extend his survival time. The passage opened into a massive underground chamber, and Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. The cavern was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium, with a high ceiling supported by natural crystal pillars. But what took his breath away was not the size of the chamber or its alien beauty. It was the figure chained to a crystalline altar in the center of the space. She was clearly not human, but her form was hauntingly familiar. Tall and slender, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was long and silver, flowing like liquid metal down her back. Her arms moved gracefully as she tested the strength of her bonds. And when she turned her head toward the sound of his approach, Marcus saw eyes like twin stars, silver and bright, and filled with an intelligence that seemed ancient beyond measure. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, but it was more than her appearance that struck him. There was something regal about her bearing, even chained as she was. The way she held her head high despite her situation, the careful way she studied him as he approached, everything about her spoke of nobility and strength. Marcus approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. The universal translator in his suit would allow them to communicate, assuming she was willing to talk to him. As he drew closer, he could see that her chains were not primitive metal, but some kind of advanced energy binding that glowed with a soft purple light. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice melodic but wary. The translator rendered her words in perfect English, though Marcus could hear the alien cadence beneath the translation. "My name is Marcus Chun," he replied, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm human. My ship crashed on the surface, and I was looking for shelter. I don't want to hurt you." She studied him for a long moment, her silver eyes moving across his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Human," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "I have heard of your species. You are new to the stars." "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "We've only been part of the galactic community for 5 years. What's your name? Why are you chained here?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "My name is Olei Thanemore, first princess of the Zilithian Empire, heir to the Sapphire Throne, and daughter of Emperor Valdris the Eternal." She gestured to her chains with one of her 4 hands. "And I am here because I refuse to marry the man my father chose for me." Marcus felt his blood run cold. A Zilithian princess. He was in the presence of royalty from one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, and she was imprisoned on this moon. The political implications were staggering, but what struck him more was the pain he could see in her eyes. Even across the vast differences between their species, he recognized the look of someone who had been betrayed by those they loved. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 15 days, she replied. "My execution is scheduled for tomorrow when the 3 suns align. It will be broadcast across the Empire as a warning to others who might consider defying imperial marriage law." The casual way she spoke of her own death sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Execution for refusing a marriage. The man my father chose is Lord Carvex of the Crimson Fleet. He is old, cruel, and commands a significant portion of our military forces. My father believes this marriage will secure his throne against potential rebellions." Her voice hardened. "I would rather die than submit to such a fate." Marcus found himself moving closer without realizing it. The injustice of the situation offended every value he had been raised with. On Earth, arranged marriages were a thing of the ancient past. The idea that someone could be executed for refusing to marry against their will was barbaric. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Some way to get you out of here." Lyralii shook her head sadly. "These chains are keyed to my biosignature. Only my father or his designated executioner can release them. And even if you could free me, where would we go? This entire moon is surrounded by Imperial warships. There is no escape." Marcus walked around the altar, examining the energy chains from different angles. His engineering training kicked in as he studied the technology. The chains were indeed sophisticated, but they were also old. The Zilithians preferred to use traditional methods for executions, and this equipment looked like it might be centuries old. "You said only your father or the executioner can release them," Marcus said slowly. "But what about a system malfunction? Every piece of technology has vulnerabilities. You cannot possibly understand Zilithian binding technology," Lyralii said, though there was a note of curiosity in her voice. "Your species has barely mastered spaceflight." Marcus pulled out his scanner and began analyzing the energy patterns of chains. "Maybe not, but I understand energy systems. And this looks like it's running on some kind of quantum field generator." He paused, studying the readings. "The field is stable, but it's not perfect. There's a slight harmonic variance in the lower spectrum." For the first time since he had found her, Lyralii looked genuinely surprised. "You can read quantum field harmonics?" "I'm an engineer," Marcus replied. already reaching into his pack for his tools. I've spent the last 3 years maintaining human ships that run on jury-rigged alien technology. You learn to improvise. As he worked, they talked. Marcus learned that Lyralii had been raised from birth to rule, educated in statecraft, military strategy, and the complex web of alliances that held the Zilithian Empire together. She had never known freedom, never been allowed to make choices for herself. Her refusal to marry Lord Carvex was the first time in her life she had ever said no to her father's commands. In return, Marcus told her about Earth, about human concepts of freedom and choice. He spoke of his sister, Sarah, who had become a doctor because she wanted to help people, not because someone had commanded her to. He talked about the small colony worlds where humans were building new societies based on the idea that every person should have the right to choose their own path. Your species sounds chaotic, Lyralii observed, but there was longing in her voice. Maybe, Marcus admitted as he adjusted a setting on his scanner. But it's our chaos. We get to choose our own mistakes. Hours passed as Marcus worked on the binding system. His air supply continued to dwindle, but he found that he cared less about his own survival with each passing moment. Something about Lyralii's situation, her quiet dignity in the face of certain death, made him want to fight for her even if it cost him his own life. The chains were more complex than he had initially realized. The quantum field generator was just one layer of a multi-tiered security system. But, as he studied it, Marcus began to see patterns that reminded him of the hybrid technologies humans had developed to interface with alien systems. The Zilithians might be ancient and powerful, but their technology was also rigid, built on assumptions that had remained unchanged for centuries. "Tell me about your father," Marcus said as he worked on recalibrating his scanner to match the chain's frequency. "What kind of man executes his own daughter for refusing a marriage?" Lyralii was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He wasn't always like this. When I was young, he would tell me stories of the ancient heroes, of queens who ruled with wisdom rather than fear. But the empire is vast, and ruling it requires compromises that eat away at your soul piece by piece. I think he stopped seeing me as his daughter years ago. Now I'm just another political tool to be used for the good of the empire." "That's not right," Marcus said firmly. "No parent should sacrifice their child for political gain." "And yet it happens across the galaxy every day," Lyralii replied. "Your species is fortunate to be small enough that you can afford idealism. When you rule billions of people across hundreds of worlds, sometimes the needs of the many must outweigh the happiness of the few." "I don't believe that," Marcus said, looking up from his work to meet her eyes. "I think that's just what tyrants tell themselves to justify their cruelty." Lyralii stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. "You truly believe that the happiness of one person matters as much as the stability of an empire?" "I believe that empires built on the suffering of individuals aren't worth preserving," Marcus replied without hesitation. As the hours wore on, Marcus felt his oxygen levels dropping to dangerous levels. His movements were becoming sluggish, and he had to rest more frequently between adjustments to his equipment. But he was close to something. The quantum field was showing signs of instability, fluctuations that suggested the binding system might be vulnerable to the right kind of electromagnetic pulse. The problem was that generating such a pulse would require more power than his equipment could provide. His scanner had emergency batteries that could deliver a significant charge, but it would be a one-time shot. If it didn't work, he would have exhausted his only tool and would likely die before he could try another approach. "You're dying," Lyralii observed as Marcus paused to catch his breath. "Your breathing has become labored, and your skin color has changed." "Low oxygen," Marcus confirmed. "I've got maybe an hour left." "Then you should return to your ship," she said gently. "There's no point in both of us dying here." Marcus looked at her, chained and helpless, but still thinking about his welfare, and felt something shift in his chest. Over the past several hours, talking with her, learning about her life and her dreams, he had come to care about her in a way that surprised him. She was brilliant, brave, and compassionate despite everything she had endured. The thought of leaving her here to face execution alone was unbearable. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Marcus, please. You barely know me. There's no reason for you to die for a lost cause. He moved closer to the altar, meeting her silver eyes with his own. Maybe not, but I've learned more about honor and courage in the past few hours talking with you than I have in my entire life up to this point. If I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather die trying to do something that matters. Lyraliai's expression softened, and for a moment Marcus saw past the princess to the woman beneath. "You strange little human," she said, her voice filled with something that might have been affection. "What are you planning?" Marcus explained his idea about the electromagnetic pulse, how it might disrupt the quantum field long enough for her to break free. It was a desperate plan with a low chance of success, but it was the only option they had. "Even if it works," Lyraliai pointed out, "we'll still be trapped on this moon with no way off." "One problem at a time," Marcus replied, making final adjustments to his scanner. "Ready?" She nodded, tensing her muscles in preparation. Marcus activated the pulse generator and felt his scanner's batteries drain in a single massive discharge. The energy chains flickered, their purple glow wavering for just a moment. It wasn't enough. The bonds held firm, and Marcus's scanner died completely. His last hope of freeing her was gone. He slumped against the side of the altar, his breathing even more labored now. The failed attempt had used up precious oxygen, and he could feel consciousness beginning to slip away at the edges. Soon he would pass out, and then it would all be over. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking up at Lyraliai. "I wanted to save you. I wish things could have been different. In another life, maybe we could have found a way to be together. I wish I could marry you." The words came out before he could stop them, a confession born of exhaustion and the strange intimacy that comes with facing death together. It was absurd, of course. They had known each other for mere hours, came from completely different species and backgrounds. But something about her had touched him deeply, and in his oxygen-starved state, all his careful emotional barriers had crumbled away. Lyraliai turned to look at him, her silver eyes wide with an expression he couldn't read. For a long moment, she was completely still. Then, slowly she smiled. "Yes," she said simply. The word hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment before beginning to race. "What?" "I said yes," Lyraliai repeated, her voice stronger now. "I accept your proposal of marriage." "But that's not... I wasn't really..." Marcus stammered, trying to make sense of what was happening. "According to ancient Zilithian law," Lyraliai said, her eyes beginning to glow with something that might have been hope, "a member of the royal family who receives and accepts a formal proposal of marriage has the right to demand a hearing before the imperial court. It's an old tradition, dating back thousands of years, but it has never been formally revoked." Understanding began to dawn on Marcus. "You're saying that if we're engaged, they can't execute you without a trial?" "More than that," Lyraliai said, her voice growing excited. "If the marriage is between a royal and a citizen of another sovereign nation, it becomes a matter of interstellar law. The Galactic Council would have to be notified." Marcus felt a sudden surge of energy despite his depleted oxygen levels. "And Earth is a member of the Galactic Council." "A junior member, yes, but still a member with rights under interstellar treaty law." Lyraliai's four hands were clenched into fists now, her entire body radiating determination. "My father would be forced to delay the execution and convene a formal hearing. It will buy us time." "Time for what?" "Time to figure out a real escape plan. Time for your government to intervene diplomatically. Time for anything to happen that might change our situation." She looked at him intently. "But, Marcus, you have to understand what you're agreeing to. Even if this works, even if we somehow survive this, you would be bound to me by laws that span the galaxy. There would be no easy way to undo it." Marcus looked at her, this alien princess who had shown more courage and wisdom in a few hours than most people displayed in a lifetime. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane, that he was making decisions based on oxygen deprivation and proximity-induced attraction. But a deeper part of him, a part he had never really listened to before, whispered that maybe sometimes the crazy choice was the right choice. "Understand," he said clearly. "Princess Lyraliai, Thanemore of the Zilithian Empire, I formally ask for your hand in marriage. And I formally accept Captain Marcus Chun of the Terran Colonial Fleet," she replied, her voice ringing with authority despite her chains. The moment the words were spoken, Marcus felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if the air around them had suddenly become charged with electricity. Lyreliai's eyes widened in surprise. "The binding," she whispered. "It's changing." Marcus looked at the energy chains and saw that their purple glow had shifted, becoming brighter and more complex. New patterns of light were swirling through the quantum field, and the harmonics his dead scanner had detected earlier were becoming audible as a low, thrumming song. "What's happening?" "Ancient Zilithian marriage bonds," Lyreliai said, her voice filled with awe. "I had heard of them, but never seen them in practice. The technology is recognizing our betrothal and implementing protective protocols. The binding system is supposed to prevent harm from coming to engaged royalty until the marriage can be properly completed or officially dissolved." The chains were indeed changing, their restrictive energy fields expanding and shifting. Instead of holding Lyreliai immobile, they now seemed to be creating a protective barrier around both of them. Marcus could actually feel his breathing ease as the field somehow began supplementing the oxygen in his blood. "So we're safe?" he asked. "For now," Lyreliai confirmed. "But this is only a temporary reprieve. The system will summon Imperial forces to escort us to a formal hearing within 72 hours. If the marriage is not completed or officially dissolved by then, the protective protocols will end, and the original execution order will be carried out." Marcus nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the enormity of what they had just done. 72 hours to figure out how to survive a situation that was impossible just a few minutes ago. "You don't seem very worried for someone who just proposed to a woman he met today," Lyreliai observed. Marcus considered this for a moment, then smiled. "I've been flying on the edge of disaster my whole life. At least this time I've got good company." "Despite everything," Lyreliai laughed, a sound like silver bells that echoed through the crystal chamber. "Marcus Chun, I think you may be the most foolish and brave man I have ever met. I'll take that as a compliment." As the protective field stabilized around them, Marcus allowed himself to hope for the first time since his ship had crashed. They were still trapped on a forbidden moon, still facing execution in 3 days, still separated by vast differences in species and background. But they were alive, and they had each other, and sometimes that was enough to build a miracle on. Outside the cave, the 3 suns of Zirian Prime began to set, painting the crystal formations in brilliant shades of red and gold. And deep underground, 2 beings from different worlds sat together in a field of protective energy, planning their next impossible move in a game where the stakes were love, freedom, and the future of interstellar relations. The real adventure was just beginning. The Imperial Guard arrived exactly 48 hours later, their sleek black ships descending from orbit like deadly birds of prey. Marcus watched through the cave entrance as they landed in perfect formation on the crystal plane above, their energy signatures making his salvaged equipment spark and flicker. He had spent the past 2 days learning everything he could about Zilithian culture, politics, and marriage law from Lyreliai, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of the Empire's most elite soldiers. They came in full ceremonial armor, their forms tall and imposing even by Zilithian standards. Each guard carried weapons that could level a small building, and their face masks were decorated with the intricate patterns that denoted their rank and service record. When they entered the cave, the very air seemed to thrum with contained violence. Princess Lyreliai, Thane Moore, the lead guard intoned, his voice deep and formal. "By order of His Imperial Majesty, you are commanded to appear before the High Court for a formal hearing regarding your claim of legitimate betrothal." The protective energy field around Marcus and Lyreliai shimmered and reconfigured itself, extending to create a secure transport bubble. Marcus felt a moment of disorientation as gravity shifted, and they were lifted smoothly from the cave floor. The technology was beyond anything humanity possessed, but the principles were familiar enough that his engineer's mind could follow the basics. "Captain Chun," the guard continued, turning his masked face toward Marcus, "you are hereby granted diplomatic immunity as the representative of a sovereign nation entering into formal marriage negotiations with the imperial family. However, be advised that this immunity is contingent upon your good behavior and the legitimacy of your claim." Marcus nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The guard's tone made it clear that they considered his very existence an insult to their princess, and he could sense the barely contained hostility beneath their formal courtesy. These were warriors who had spent their lives protecting the imperial bloodline, and here he was, a primitive human claiming the right to marry their future empress. The journey to the imperial flagship took less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Marcus pressed against the transport bubble's transparent wall, staring out at the massive warships that surrounded Zirian Prime. Each vessel was larger than Earth's entire space fleet, and their weapons could crack planets. He was looking at the military might that kept hundreds of worlds in line, and somehow he had volunteered to challenge it. The flagship itself was beyond impressive. The eternal radiance stretched for kilometers in every direction, its hull gleaming with the deep blue metal that marked Zilithian royalty. Spires and towers rose from its surface like a crystal city floating in space, and energy fields crackled between them in patterns that were both beautiful and deadly. It was less a ship than a floating palace, a demonstration of power that could be seen from orbit. As their transport bubble guided them through the massive docking bay, Marcus caught sight of hundreds of smaller vessels arranged in perfect rows. Fighter craft, assault ships, diplomatic shuttles, and stranger vessels whose purpose he couldn't even guess. The bay alone was larger than most cities, and it was just one small part of the flagship's enormous bulk. "Impressive, isn't it?" Lyralii said quietly, noticing his expression. "The eternal radiance is my father's pride and joy. It took 50 years to build and represents the finest achievements of Zilithian engineering. When I was a child, I thought it was the most beautiful thing in the universe. And now I see it as the chain around my people's necks," she replied, her voice sad. "All that beauty, all that power, and it's used primarily to enforce my father's will across the stars." The guards escorted them through corridors that were works of art in themselves. The walls were made of the same crystal material as Zirian Prime's surface, but shaped and polished until they seemed to glow with inner fire. Holographic displays showed star maps, battle formations, and constantly updating feeds from across the Empire. Servants and minor officials bowed deeply as Lyralii passed, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes filled with curiosity about the strange alien walking beside her. Marcus had expected to be taken to some kind of holding cell or waiting room, but instead they were brought to what could only be described as a guest suite. The rooms were enormous, decorated with artifacts from dozens of worlds, and furnished with pieces that probably cost more than most planets' annual budgets. A wall of transparent aluminum looked out over the ship's hull toward the stars beyond, and Marcus could see other Imperial vessels maintaining their formation in the distance. "You will remain here until the hearing begins," the guard captain informed them. "Food and refreshment will be provided. Medical attention is available if required. Do not attempt to leave these quarters without escort." When the guards left, Marcus and Lyralii found themselves truly alone together for the first time since their betrothal. The protective energy field had dissipated once they were aboard the ship, and Marcus realized how much he had gotten used to its subtle effects. Without it, the weight of their situation seemed much heavier. "Are you having second thoughts?" Lyralii asked, watching him from across the suite's main room. Marcus considered the question seriously. Over the past 48 hours, as they had planned and prepared for this moment, he had found himself drawn to her in ways that went far beyond simple attraction. She was brilliant, discussing complex political theories with the ease of someone who had been raised to rule. She was brave, facing potential death with a calm dignity that awed him. And she was kind, constantly worried about his welfare, even when her own life hung in the balance. But more than that, she was interesting. Their conversations had ranged across philosophy, science, art, and culture. She challenged his assumptions while genuinely listening to his ideas. When he explained human concepts like democracy and individual rights, she didn't dismiss them as primitive nonsense, but examined them with the careful attention of someone who understood that good ideas could come from anywhere. "No," he said finally. "No second thoughts. What about you?" Lyralii moved to the viewport, looking out at the stars. "I've been thinking about what you said about empires built on suffering not being worth preserving. For the first time in my life, I'm wondering if you might be right. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw a new determination in her silver eyes. Marcus, I need you to understand something before we go into that hearing. My father is not going to simply accept our betrothal and wish us well. He's going to try to destroy you, to prove that humans are unworthy of joining the imperial bloodline. He'll use everything at his disposal to discredit you and our engagement. What kind of everything? He'll question your intelligence, your honor, your species' right to exist on equal terms with the older races. He'll bring up every mistake humanity has made since joining the galactic community. He'll try to paint you as a barbaric opportunist who's taking advantage of my situation for personal gain. Lyraliai's hands clenched into fists. And if none of that works, he may simply declare that alien marriages are invalid under imperial law and order your execution alongside mine. Marcus nodded slowly. So we're walking into a trap. Yes, but it's also an opportunity. The hearing will be broadcast across the Empire, and my father will be forced to follow at least the basic forms of justice. If we can make a strong enough case, if we can convince enough people that our betrothal is legitimate and that the Empire's marriage laws are unjust, we might be able to create enough political pressure to change things. You want to use our trial to start a revolution? Lyraliai smiled, and for a moment she looked less like an alien princess and more like a young woman planning to change the world. Not a revolution exactly, more like an evolution. The Empire has been stagnant for too long, ruled by fear and tradition instead of wisdom and justice. Maybe it's time for new ideas. Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed, and a small army of servants entered. They carried clothing, cosmetics, and accessories that were clearly intended to prepare both of them for the hearing. Marcus found himself handed over to a team of Zalithian tailors who measured him with instruments he didn't recognize and spoke in rapid, technical terms about fabrics and fittings. The outfit they produced was unlike anything he had ever worn. The base layer was a form-fitting bodysuit made from material that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. Over that went a formal jacket cut in lines that somehow managed to be both elegantly alien and surprisingly flattering to his human proportions. The colors were deep blue and silver, which the chief tailor explained were appropriate for someone entering the imperial bloodline, but not yet confirmed in rank. When he finally saw himself in the mirror, Marcus barely recognized his reflection. The clothes transformed him from a crash pilot into someone who looked like he might actually belong in an imperial court. It was a reminder that appearance mattered in politics, that people made judgments based on how you presented yourself as much as what you said. Lyraliai's transformation was even more dramatic. Her servants had dressed her in the formal robes of an unmarried princess, layers of flowing fabric that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated delicate crystal ornaments, and her 4 hands bore rings that marked her royal status. She was beautiful before, but now she looked every inch the future empress she was born to be. "You look stunning," Marcus said when they were finally alone again. "You look terrified," she replied with gentle amusement. "I am terrified," Marcus admitted. "I'm about to go before the most powerful man in this part of the galaxy and convince him that his daughter should marry a human he's never met. The smart play would be to run. And yet you're still here. And yet I'm still here," Marcus agreed. "Lyraliai, before we go in there, I need to ask you something. If this works, if we somehow convince your father to accept our engagement, what happens then? Do we actually get married? Do we try to build a life together? I know this started as a legal maneuver, but it's becoming something more for me, and I need to know where you stand." Lyraliai was quiet for a long moment, her silver eyes studying his face. "I've been wondering the same thing," she said finally. "When I accepted your proposal, I was thinking only of survival. But these past few days, talking with you, learning about your world and your values. Marcus, I've never met anyone like you. You see possibilities where others see only obstacles. You believe in things like justice and freedom not because they're practical but because they're right." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her silver eyes. "If we survive this, if we somehow find a way to be together, I think I would like to discover what a marriage based on choice rather than obligation might be like." Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed again. This time it was the guard captain, come to escort them to the hearing. His expression was unreadable behind his ceremonial mask, but Marcus could sense disapproval radiating from his rigid posture. The walk to the imperial courtroom took them through the heart of the eternal radiance. They passed laboratories where Zilithian scientists worked on projects that pushed the boundaries of known physics. They saw training rooms where young nobles practiced combat forms that were both deadly and beautiful. They walked through galleries filled with art treasures from across the empire, priceless artifacts that represented the cultural achievements of hundreds of civilizations. It was a reminder of what they were challenging. The Zilithian Empire wasn't just a political entity, it was a civilization that had endured for millennia. It had brought peace and order to vast regions of space, had preserved knowledge and culture that might otherwise have been lost. Whatever its flaws, it represented something larger and more significant than any individual's happiness. The courtroom itself was designed to intimidate. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by pillars carved from single massive crystals. The walls were covered with holographic displays showing the symbols of every world in the empire, a visual reminder of the scope of imperial power. At the far end of the room sat the sapphire throne, carved from a single enormous gem that seemed to contain its own miniature galaxy of swirling lights. Emperor Valdris the Eternal sat upon that throne like a figure from legend. He was tall even by Zilithian standards, with a pale blue skin and silver hair that marked royal blood. His four arms were arranged in a pose of casual power, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. Unlike his daughter, there was nothing warm or approachable about him. He radiated authority the way a star radiates heat, and Marcus understood immediately why this man commanded the loyalty of hundreds of worlds. The courtroom was filled with observers, representatives from every major house in the empire, ambassadors from client species, military officers, and court functionaries. Marcus spotted several figures in the distinctive robes of Galactic Council observers, and his heart lifted slightly. If the council was here, then Earth's interests wouldn't go completely unrepresented. Princess Liliai, Thanemore, the Emperor's voice carried easily across the vast room without any apparent amplification. You stand accused of defying imperial marriage law, of refusing a betrothal arranged for the good of the empire, and of bringing disgrace upon the royal bloodline. How do you answer these charges? Liliai straightened, every inch the princess despite her precarious situation. I acknowledge that I refused the marriage arrangement you made with Lord Carvex, your imperial majesty. However, I dispute that this action violates imperial law, as I had already accepted a legitimate proposal of marriage from Captain Marcus Chun of the Terran Colonial Fleet. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus could feel hundreds of alien eyes focusing on him, evaluating him, finding him lacking. He forced himself to stand straight and meet the Emperor's gaze, though doing so felt like staring into the heart of Star. Captain Chun, the Emperor said, his tone making Marcus's name sound like an insult. You claim to have proposed marriage to the heir to the Sapphire Throne. Under what authority do you make such a claim? Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. Under the authority granted to me as a citizen of Earth, a sovereign member nation of the Galactic Council, your Imperial Majesty. I offered marriage, and Princess Liliai accepted freely, creating a binding engagement under both Terran and traditional Zilithian law. Traditional Zilithian law, the Emperor repeated mockingly. And what does a primitive human know of Zilithian tradition? This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for. He had spent every available minute since their betrothal studying Zilithian legal precedents with Liliai, looking for the exact historical citations they would need. According to the Codex of Royal Marriages established by Emperor Thalen the Wise in the Third Imperial Era, any member of the royal bloodline has the right to accept or reject marriage proposals from representatives of sovereign nations. The only requirements are that the proposal be made freely, accepted clearly, and witnessed by parties capable of attesting to the legitimacy of both participants. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise in his eyes. You quote ancient law to me, human. I quote your own law, your Imperial Majesty. Law that has never been revoked or superseded. Marcus felt his confidence growing. This was familiar territory now, the careful examination of rules and regulations that his engineering background had trained him for. Furthermore, the Galactic Council Charter, which the Zilithian Empire signed and ratified, guarantees the right of member species to form binding relationships across cultural and biological boundaries. The Galactic Council, the Emperor said dismissively, a collection of chattering bureaucrats with no real power. A collection of sovereign nations that includes Earth, Marcus replied firmly. Nations that would be very interested to learn that the Zilithian Empire considers their citizens unworthy of basic diplomatic rights. The threat was mild but real. The Emperor ruled through strength, but he also understood politics. A diplomatic incident with multiple council members could complicate his relationships across the galaxy, potentially providing opportunities for his enemies. Very well, the Emperor said after a moment's pause. Let us examine the legitimacy of your claim, Captain Shun. Tell this court why you believe yourself worthy to join the Imperial bloodline. Marcus took a deep breath. This was where things got dangerous. He could try to list his accomplishments, his service record, his technical expertise. But that would be playing the Emperor's game, trying to prove his worth by Imperial standards. Instead, he decided to do something that was either brilliant or suicidal. I don't believe I'm worthy to join the Imperial bloodline, Your Imperial Majesty, he said clearly. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Lyraliai's eyes widened, though she trusted him enough not to interrupt. The Emperor leaned forward slightly, clearly not having expected this response. I don't believe I'm worthy, Marcus continued, because I don't believe anyone is inherently more or less worthy than anyone else based on the circumstances of their birth. What I believe is that I love your daughter, that she loves me, and that we have the right to choose our own fate regardless of political convenience or tradition. Love. The Emperor said the word like he was tasting something distasteful. You would base the future of empires on such a trivial emotion. I would base the future of empires on respect for the individual rights of their citizens, Marcus replied, on the idea that governments exist to serve people, not the other way around, on the belief that a marriage based on choice and mutual affection will always be stronger than one based on political calculation. And you believe these primitive human values should supersede thousands of years of imperial tradition? Marcus looked across the courtroom at the assembled representatives of hundreds of worlds. I believe that any tradition that requires the execution of innocent people for exercising basic freedom of choice is a tradition that has outlived its usefulness. The Emperor's expression darkened dangerously. You dare to judge the Empire? You, whose species has barely learned to leave its own star system. I judge systems of government based on how they treat their most vulnerable citizens, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. By that standard, any empire that would execute its own daughter for refusing an arranged marriage has failed the most basic test of justice. Enough, the Emperor's voice boomed through the courtroom. You know nothing of the burdens of leadership, the sacrifices required to maintain order across hundreds of worlds. The marriage of the royal bloodline is not about personal happiness. It is about stability, about preventing the civil wars that could kill billions. And yet, Lyraliai said, speaking for the first time since the formal charges were read, those same civil wars you fear are more likely if the people lose faith in the justice of imperial rule. The Emperor turned his attention to his daughter, and Marcus could see something painful flicker across his features. Lyraliai, you are my heir, my greatest treasure. Everything I have done has been to secure your future, to ensure that you inherit an empire at peace. Father, Lyraliai said, and for a moment she sounded less like a princess and more like a young woman who missed her parent. I understand your concerns. But look around this courtroom. Look at the representatives watching us. Do you see peace in their eyes, or do you see fear? An empire built on fear is not a legacy worth preserving. Marcus watched the interaction between father and daughter, seeing for the first time the genuine pain on both sides. The Emperor wasn't simply a tyrant. He was a man who believed he was making necessary sacrifices for the greater good. And Lyraliai wasn't just a rebellious daughter. She was someone who saw a different path forward for her people. You would tear down everything I've built, the Emperor said quietly. I would build something better on the foundation you created, Lyraliai replied. Father, Captain Shun comes from a species that has known war, oppression, and suffering. But they have also learned to choose cooperation over conquest, to value individual freedom alongside collective responsibility. Perhaps it is time for the Empire to learn from newer voices. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes moving between his daughter and the human who had disrupted his carefully laid plans. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired in a way that spoke of centuries of difficult decisions. "Lord Carvex," he said, and Marcus turned to see a figure in military dress step forward from the crowd. The man was older, scarred, with the bearing of a career soldier. His eyes were cold as they fixed on Marcus, and his hand rested casually on the hilt of an energy sword. "Your Imperial Majesty," Carvex said, his voice gravelly with age and battle damage. "You have heard the claims made here today. As the injured party in this matter, what is your response?" Carvex stepped into the center of the courtroom, his presence immediately making the space feel more dangerous. "Your Imperial Majesty, I have served the Empire for 3 centuries. I have conquered worlds in your name, suppressed rebellions, maintained order across the frontier. I was promised the hand of Princess Lyralii as reward for my service and as security for my continued loyalty." He turned to look at Marcus, his scarred face twisting into what might have been a smile. "This human insults not only me, but the entire Imperial military by suggesting that his primitive affections matter more than the honor and service of a true warrior." "What do you propose?" the Emperor asked. "Trial by combat," Carvex said simply. "Let the human prove his worth in honest battle. If he defeats me, I will withdraw my claim and acknowledge his right to marry the princess. If I defeat him, the betrothal is void and the original marriage arrangement stands." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Trial by combat was an ancient tradition among warrior cultures, and the Zilithians were definitely warriors. But Marcus was an engineer, not a fighter. He had basic military training, but nothing that would prepare him to face a 3-century veteran in single combat. "An interesting proposal," the Emperor mused. "What say you, Captain Shun? Are you willing to prove your worth with blade and courage as well as words and law?" Marcus looked at Lyralii, seeing the fear in her silver eyes. If he accepted and lost, she would be condemned to marriage with a man she despised. If he refused, they would both likely face execution for contempt of court. It was another impossible choice in a situation full of them. But as he stood there, feeling the weight of the Emperor's gaze and the expectant silence of the courtroom, Marcus realized that he had already made his decision days ago in a crystal cave on a forbidden moon. He had chosen to fight for love over law, for hope over despair, for the chance to build something better rather than accepting the way things had always been. "I accept," he said clearly. "I will face Lord Carvex in trial by combat." The Emperor nodded slowly. "Very well. The trial will commence immediately. Lord Carvex, select your weapon." "Blade combat," Carvex said without hesitation. "Energy swords, no armor, first blood or yield." Marcus nodded his acceptance, though his mouth had gone completely dry. He had never used an energy sword in his life, and Carvex looked like he could carve him into pieces without breaking a sweat. But sometimes courage wasn't about having a plan. Sometimes it was just about refusing to quit when quitting was the sensible thing to do. As attendants prepared the combat arena in the center of the courtroom, Marcus caught Lyralii's eye one more time. She looked terrified, but also proud, and when she mouthed the words, "I love you," he felt his heart soar despite the desperate circumstances. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, at least he would face it knowing that someone believed in him. And sometimes, Marcus thought as he accepted the energy sword from the court's weapon master, that was enough to work miracles. The energy sword felt alien in Marcus's hands, its weight distribution unlike any weapon he had ever trained with. The blade itself was pure light contained within a coherent energy field, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. As he tested its balance, Marcus could feel the weapon humming with barely contained power. A single touch from that blade would slice through flesh and bone like they were made of paper. Lord Carvex moved to the opposite side of the impromptu arena, his own weapon gleaming in his scarred hands. The old warrior rolled his shoulders and stretched his neck, warming up with the casual confidence of someone who had fought thousands of duels and survived them all. His energy sword danced through complex patterns as he practiced, the blade leaving trails of light in the air that spoke of perfect muscle memory and decades of training. "Last chance, human," Carvex called across the arena. "Withdraw your claim, and I will make your death quick and honorable." Marcus looked around the courtroom, at the hundreds of faces watching this impossible confrontation. Some showed anticipation, others disgust, a few what might have been sympathy. But when his eyes found Lyrali's eyes, he saw something that gave him strength, absolute faith. She believed he could do this, even when he didn't believe it himself. "I'm not withdrawing anything," Marcus replied, bringing his sword up in a basic guard position. "Let's get this over with." The Emperor raised his hand, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Let the trial by combat begin. Fight with honor, and may justice be served." Carvex attacked immediately, his blade moving in a silver arc that would have taken Marcus's head off if he hadn't stumbled backward in a panic. The Zilithian warrior was fast, faster than anything his size had any right to be, and his sword work was poetry written in light and violence. Marcus barely managed to get his own blade up in time to block the second strike, the impact sending shockwaves up his arms. Carvex's strength was enormous, and the older warrior was clearly toying with him, using just enough force to keep him off balance without ending the fight immediately. "You fight like a child," Carvex snarled, pressing his attack. "Where is the human warrior spirit your species is supposedly known for?" Marcus gave ground steadily, his blocks becoming increasingly desperate as Carvex's assault intensified. He had basic sword training from his military service, but it was nothing compared to the lifetime of experience his opponent brought to bear. Every strike was perfectly placed, every movement economical and deadly. "You cannot win," Carvex continued, his blade work becoming more complex as he drove Marcus toward the edge of the arena. "You are weak, untrained, unworthy of the princess's hand. Surrender now and spare yourself further humiliation." But as Marcus fought for his life, something strange began to happen. The desperate fear that had gripped him when the combat began was giving way to a different kind of clarity. His engineering mind, trained to analyze complex systems under pressure, was starting to see patterns in Carvex's attacks. The old warrior was skilled, yes, but he was also predictable. His techniques were classical, formal, based on centuries-old training methods. Marcus had learned to fight in bar brawls and back alley scraps during his time on the frontier colonies. His style was crude and improvised, but it was also unpredictable. When Carvex came in with a textbook overhead strike, Marcus didn't try to block it properly. Instead, he rolled sideways and came up swinging wildly, forcing the Zilithian to abort his attack and leap backward. "Coward!" Carvex spat. "Fight with honor." "I'm fighting to win," Marcus replied, and for the first time since the combat began, he went on the attack. His offensive was clumsy, but energetic, mixing basic sword techniques with moves he had learned in unarmed combat, and a few things he improvised on the spot. Carvex easily parried his strikes, but Marcus could see confusion creeping into the warrior's eyes. This wasn't how humans were supposed to fight. Their military reports described humans as brutal but disciplined, dangerous but predictable. Marcus wasn't following any patterns Carvex had studied. The crowd was murmuring now, some in disgust at Marcus's unconventional tactics, others in growing interest. The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes sharp as he studied the developing fight. Even Lyrali was watching with something that might have been hope beginning to shine in her silver eyes. Carvex adjusted his strategy, becoming more aggressive in an attempt to end the fight quickly. He unleashed a flurry of strikes that would have overwhelmed any conventionally trained opponent, his blade moving so fast it was hard to follow with the naked eye. Marcus gave ground again, but this time he was doing it deliberately, drawing Carvex into overcommitting to his attacks. When a moment came, Marcus moved with desperate precision. As Carvex committed to a powerful thrust that would have skewered him, Marcus twisted aside and grabbed the Zilithian's sword arm with his free hand. It was a completely illegal move in formal dueling, but this wasn't a formal duel anymore. This was a fight for everything Marcus cared about. Using Carvex's momentum against him, Marcus spun and threw the larger warrior across the arena. Carvex hit the crystal floor hard but rolled to his feet with predatory grace, his scarred face now showing genuine anger for the first time. "You fight like an animal," he growled. "I fight like a human," Marcus corrected, his breathing labored, but his confidence growing. "We don't have 3 centuries to learn perfect technique. We make it up as we go along." The next exchange was even more brutal. Carvex abandoned any pretense of elegance, focusing on raw power and speed designed to batter through Marcus's defenses. But Marcus had found his rhythm now. He didn't try to match Carvex's technical skill. Instead, he fought dirty, using every trick he had learned in a lifetime of improvisation. When Carvex came in high, Marcus went low, sweeping at his legs. When the warrior adapted and stayed mobile, Marcus threw a handful of crystal dust from the arena floor, forcing Carvex to fight partially blinded. When conventional attacks failed, Marcus used his environment, bouncing off the arena walls to change his angle of attack and confusing his opponent's timing. The crowd was on their feet now, some shouting encouragement, others hurling insults. The formal atmosphere of the Imperial Court had given way to something more primal, more honest. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a test of wills, a clash between different philosophies of power and worth. Carvex was beginning to slow. He was in excellent condition for his age, but 3 centuries of life were still 3 centuries, and his burst of rage-fueled energy was starting to fade. Marcus, younger and desperate, pressed his advantage. His attacks were still crude, but they were constant, forcing Carvex to defend against unpredictable angles and awkward combinations. "You cannot defeat me," Carvex panted, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "I'm a warrior of the Empire. I have conquered worlds." "You're a relic," Marcus replied, continuing his assault. "You're everything wrong with this empire wrapped up in fancy armor and ancient traditions." That insult hit home harder than any blade thrust. Carvex's face contorted with fury, and he launched himself into a berserker attack that sacrificed all defense for the chance to land a killing blow. His energy sword carved brilliant arcs through the air, each strike carrying enough force to cut through starship armor. But fury made him sloppy, and Marcus had been waiting for exactly this moment. As Carvex overextended himself in a massive overhead strike, Marcus stepped inside his guard and drove his elbow into the warrior's solar plexus with every ounce of strength he possessed. Carvex doubled over, gasping, and Marcus brought his sword up in a move that would have been impossible if his opponent had been prepared for it. The energy blade stopped just short of Carvex's throat, close enough that the old warrior could feel the heat radiating from the coherent light. "Yield," Marcus said quietly. The arena fell completely silent. Carvex stood frozen, his own sword lowered, Marcus's blade a hair's breadth from ending his life. His scarred face was twisted with a mixture of rage, disbelief, and something that might have been respect. "You fight without honor," Carvex said finally. "I fight for love," Marcus replied. "That's the only honor that matters to me." For a long moment, the two warriors stood locked in tableau. Then, slowly, Carvex stepped back and let his sword fall to the arena floor. The weapon deactivated automatically as it left his grasp, its blade of light disappearing with a soft hum. "I yield," the old warrior said formally. "The human has proven his worth in combat. I withdraw my claim to Princess Lyraliai's hand." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some spectators cheered, others shouted protests, and still others seemed simply stunned by what they had witnessed. A human, a member of a species barely 5 years removed from its home system, had defeated one of the Empire's greatest warriors in single combat. It was unprecedented, impossible, and absolutely undeniable. Emperor Valdris remained seated on his throne, his expression unreadable. When he raised his hand for silence, the courtroom gradually quieted, though Marcus could still feel the electric tension in the air. "Captain Shun," the Emperor said, his voice carrying clearly across the arena, "you have proven your courage and determination beyond question. However, trial by combat determines only that your claim has merit. It does not automatically resolve all legal questions regarding your proposed marriage to my daughter." Marcus felt his heart sink. Even in victory, the Emperor was finding ways to delay and complicate their situation. He should have expected this. Powerful men didn't give up their plans easily, especially when those plans involve controlling the succession to an interstellar empire. What additional requirements must I meet, Your Imperial Majesty? Marcus asked, trying to keep the exhaustion out of his voice. The fight with Carvex had drained him more than he cared to admit, and he wasn't sure how many more trials he could endure. The marriage of the Imperial heir must be approved not only by the Emperor, but by the High Council of Noble Houses, Valdris replied. Representatives from the 12 most powerful families in the Empire must vote on whether to accept your betrothal. A simple majority is required for approval. Marcus looked around the courtroom, studying the faces of the various nobles and representatives. Most of them looked like they would rather vote to have him executed than welcomed into the imperial family. The chances of getting 7 out of 12 votes seemed virtually non-existent. However, the emperor continued, and Marcus caught something that might have been amusement in his tone. There's another option available under ancient law. If the prospective spouse can demonstrate exceptional value to the empire through service or achievement, the council vote can be bypassed by imperial decree. What kind of service? Lyralii asked, speaking for the first time since the combat began. Marcus could hear the wariness in her voice. She knew her father well enough to suspect that any service he proposed would be designed to be impossible or deadly. The Empire currently faces a crisis that threatens the stability of entire star systems, the Emperor said. In the Vega sector, a coalition of rebel worlds has declared independence and formed what they call the Free Worlds Alliance. They have acquired weapons technology that allows them to threaten even Imperial warships, and their rebellion is spreading to other systems. Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to see where this was leading. The Emperor wasn't just creating an impossible task. He was trying to solve a real problem while getting rid of an inconvenient human. Standard military approaches have failed, Valdris continued. The rebels are too well entrenched and their popular support too strong for conventional conquest. However, intelligence suggests that their leadership might be willing to negotiate with neutral parties, particularly representatives of younger galactic civilizations who have no stake in imperial politics. You want me to negotiate a peace settlement, Marcus said. I want you to end the rebellion, the Emperor corrected, whether through negotiation, sabotage, or any other means you deem appropriate. Succeed, and you will have demonstrated value to the Empire beyond question. Fail, and your betrothal to my daughter becomes invalid. It was a clever trap. If Marcus succeeded, the Emperor would gain credit for ending a dangerous rebellion through unconventional means. If he failed, Marcus would likely be killed in the attempt, removing the inconvenient human from the imperial bloodline. And if he refused the mission, it could be painted as cowardice, invalidating his right to marry Lyralii. What resources would I have for this mission? Marcus asked. A ship, a small crew, and Princess Lyralii as your diplomatic partner, the Emperor replied. After all, the rebels are unlikely to trust a lone human, but they might be willing to negotiate with someone of imperial blood who has demonstrated independence from traditional policies. Marcus looked at Lyralii, seeing understanding pass between them. The Emperor was sending them both into what he assumed would be a death trap, but he was also giving them something precious. Time together, away from the imperial court, with a chance to prove themselves on their own terms. I accept the mission, Marcus said formally, but I have conditions. The Emperor's eyebrows rose slightly. You dare to make demands? I make requests, Marcus corrected. First, I want to choose my own crew. Second, I want access to all available intelligence on the rebel faction. Third, I want authorization to negotiate in good faith, with the power to offer real concessions rather than empty promises. And if your negotiations fail, Marcus met the Emperor's gaze steadily. Then, I'll find another way to end the conflict. But I won't massacre civilians or destroy worlds just to prove my worth to you. For the first time since Marcus had met him, Emperor Valdris smiled. It wasn't a warm expression, but there was something like approval in it. You continue to surprise me, Captain Shun. Very well. Your requests are granted. You will depart within the week. As the formal hearing drew to a close, Marcus found himself surrounded by courtiers and officials offering congratulations, threats, and advice in equal measure. Some seemed genuinely impressed by his victory over Carvex, while others made it clear they considered his success a fluke that wouldn't be repeated. Through it all, Marcus kept his attention focused on Lyralii. She was handling the political maneuvering with practiced ease, accepting congratulations graciously while carefully avoiding any commitments that might compromise their future mission. But when their eyes met across the crowded room, he could see the same mixture of hope and apprehension that he felt himself. They had won the first battle, but the war for their future was just beginning. In a few days, they would be alone together on a ship headed into rebel territory, with only their wits and courage to guide them. It should have been terrifying, and part of Marcus was definitely afraid. But another part of him was excited by the possibilities. For the first time since this whole adventure began, they would have a chance to work as partners rather than prisoners. They would face dangers and challenges together, make decisions that mattered, and maybe find a way to build the future they both wanted. As the crowd began to disperse, Lord Carvex approached Marcus one final time. The old warrior's face was still bruised from their combat, but his expression was thoughtful rather than hostile. "You fought well for someone with no formal training," he said grudgingly. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "For what it's worth, I hope I didn't embarrass you too badly." Carvex actually chuckled at that. "Boy, I've been fighting for 3 centuries. A few scars and bruises don't embarrass me. But you should know that what you accomplished here today was more than just winning a duel. You've given hope to every young person in the Empire who has ever felt trapped by tradition and expectation." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The Rebel Alliance you're being sent to face, they're not the monsters the Imperial propaganda make them out to be. They're mostly young people who want the same things your species values: freedom, choice, the right to determine their own futures. Keep that in mind when you meet with them." Before Marcus could respond, Carvex turned and walked away, leaving him with yet another piece of the complex puzzle he was trying to solve. The Empire was more divided than he had realized, with fault lines running through every level of society. The mission ahead would require more than just diplomatic skill. It would require understanding the deeper currents that were reshaping galactic politics. As the last of the courtiers finally departed, Marcus and Lyralii found themselves alone in the vast courtroom. The silence felt strange after all the noise and chaos of the hearing, but it was also peaceful in a way that allowed them to finally process what had just happened. "We actually did it," Lyralii said softly. "We survived the hearing, we won the trial by combat, and we bought ourselves time to figure out the rest." "Your father is clever," Marcus replied. "He's given us exactly what we wanted while making sure we'll probably die trying to achieve it." "Probably," Lyralii agreed, "but not certainly, and sometimes probably is good enough to build a miracle on." Marcus took her hand, marveling at the way her 4 fingers intertwined with his 5. It should have felt alien, but instead it felt right, like 2 puzzle pieces that had finally found their proper places. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "Ready to leave everything you've ever known and fly off into rebel territory with a human you met less than a week ago?" Lyralii smiled, and in that moment she looked less like an imperial princess and more like a young woman ready to take on the universe. "Marcus Chun, I've been ready for an adventure my entire life. I just never knew it would come in the form of a crashed pilot with terrible sword technique and an unshakable belief in impossible things." "Hey, my sword technique won, didn't it?" "Your sword technique was appalling," she replied with mock severity. "You won through sheer, stubborn refusal to give up, which, now that I think about it, might be exactly the quality we'll need for what comes next." Hand in hand, they walked out of the Imperial courtroom and toward whatever future they could build together. Behind them, the sapphire throne sat empty, its crystalline facets reflecting the light of distant stars. Ahead of them lay adventure, danger, and the chance to prove that love really could change the galaxy. The real test was about to begin. The ship Emperor Valdres provided for their mission was a study in calculated insult disguised as generosity. The INV Starfire was technically a diplomatic vessel, but it was old, outdated, and barely large enough to house the crew of 12 that Marcus had been allowed to recruit. The weapon systems were defensive only, the shields were 2 generations behind current technology, and the faster-than-light drive made concerning noises every time engaged. Marcus stood in the tiny engineering section, running diagnostics on systems that should have been replaced decades ago. The ship was functional, but barely, and he suspected that was exactly what the Emperor had intended. If they were going to succeed in this mission, it would be through skill and determination rather than superior firepower or cutting-edge technology. "The good news," said Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chun, his sister who had insisted on joining the crew despite his protests, "is that this piece of junk is so old that nobody will consider it a threat. The bad news is that it might fall apart before we reach rebel territory." Marcus smiled despite their circumstances. Having Sarah aboard was both a comfort and a worry. She was an excellent medic and had proven herself capable in dangerous situations, but she was also the most important person in his life aside from Lyralii. The thought of putting her in harm's way made his chest ache, but he also knew she would never forgive him if he left her behind. "The ship will hold together," he said with more confidence than he felt. "I've made enough modifications to keep her running. And if things get really bad, I can always cannibalize some of the diplomatic equipment to boost the engines." Speaking of diplomatic equipment, came Lyralii's voice from the corridor. "I need to show you something." Marcus followed her to what passed for the ship's briefing room, where she had spread out intelligence reports and star charts covering their destination. The Free World Alliance controlled 17 star systems in the Vega sector, including several major industrial worlds that had been key sources of raw materials for the Empire. Their rebellion had cut off shipping lanes and disrupted trade throughout the region. "I've been studying the rebel leadership," Lyralii said, pointing to holographic profiles that floated above the table. "This is Zara Vex, their primary military commander. She's young, brilliant, and has somehow managed to acquire weapons technology that can punch through Imperial shielding. Intelligence suggests she may have allies among younger, noble houses who are dissatisfied with my father's policies." The hologram showed a woman who looked to be in her 30s, with the pale blue skin and silver hair that marked Zalithian nobility. But her clothes were practical rather than ornate, and her eyes held the hardness that came from making life and death decisions on a regular basis. In this, Lyralii continued, manipulating the display to show another figure, is Dr. Cale Thorne, their political leader and chief negotiator. He's the one who drafted the Alliance's Declaration of Independence, and he's the person we'll need to convince if we want to end this conflict peacefully. Dr. Thorne was older than Vex, perhaps 50 in human terms, with a lean build of someone who spent more time thinking than fighting. His background showed advanced degrees in political science and interstellar law, and he had once been a professor at the Imperial Academy before resigning in protest over what he called the systematic oppression of younger worlds. "They're not monsters," Marcus observed, studying the profiles. "They look like people who genuinely believe they're fighting for something important." "That's what makes this situation so dangerous," Lyralii replied. "If they were simple pirates or terrorists, the Empire could justify any level of force necessary to stop them. But they're idealists with legitimate grievances, which means crushing them militarily would create martyrs and inspire other rebellions." Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the complexity of their mission. The Emperor hadn't sent them just to end one rebellion. He was trying to prevent a cascade of similar uprisings across the Empire. If they could find a peaceful solution that addressed the rebels' concerns without undermining Imperial authority, it might serve as a template for dealing with other dissatisfied systems. "What about their weapons technology?" he asked. "The reports mention that they have something that can threaten Imperial warships." Lyralii's expression grew troubled. "That's the part that worries me most. According to intelligence, they've developed some kind of new torpedo that can overload particle shields through harmonic resonance. The technical specifications don't make complete sense,